Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. This is particularly exciting for us to have Representative Carolyn Maloney here.
Thank you.
I am thrilled because of this tremendous, distinguished legislative career you have. I'm thrilled as a fellow New Yorker.
Great. New Yorkers?
So Representative Maloney was first took her seat in Congress in 1992 from New York's 12th District. She's a national leader on financial services, national security, the economy, and women's issues. She is currently chairwoman of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, and she tells me that we have a limited time with her because she has a meeting with the speaker in just a few minutes, so not a little more than a few minutes, but not much more than a few minutes. She has authored and passed more than 70 measures, either as standalone bills or measures that are incorporated into larger legislation packages. And 10 of these bills were signed into law at formal and these rare presidential signing ceremonies. We are particularly delighted to have her here to speak about financial transparency and BSA reform. And I think you're excited to talk first off about the Corporate Transparency Act.
Absolutely. This is a bill that I think is incredibly important to our country. It's something we should have done, and it would bring transparency to these LLCs. Right now, you can't break into them. And I represent New York City, so there's a tremendous concern about combating not just money laundering, but terrorism financing. So if you can cut down on the terrorism financing, you can cut down on terrorism. You can go through my district at night, and you'll see buildings, and there are no lights on. They're all bank accounts, a lot of them. And you can't even find out who owns them or where the money's coming from. This issue was first brought to my attention by the system in New York that was combating financial terrorism and any type of terrorism. We have it a lot of times. We had 9/11, but we have other attacks, and the question is always, how do they finance it? So law enforcement in New York is very interested. It's in our national security interest and our own protection to know who is housing money. I remember when the Panama Papers came out, everybody was looking, and I said, hey, this is great. There are no New Yorkers in there. There's not a lot of Americans in there. But then you look at it, they don't have to go to Panama. They can hide anything they want legally here in America. And there have been several documentaries, the 60-minute one, where they interview several lawyers and say that they want to hide all this money. And they say, whatever you do, don't go to a bank, because the bank secrecy, they'll know who you are. You can go to an LLC and you're completely protected. And we can't allow that to happen. So I'm proud to have authored this bill. I've worked on it over 10 years. It was a hard, long road putting together the pieces that brought everybody together on both sides of the aisle. It has passed the House with strong bipartisan support, and it's being negotiated now by the leadership in the Senate. Sherrod Brown and Crapo Cropper is negotiating it as we speak, and I think we'll have a bill, hopefully, that'll pass this year and be signed into law.
I think it's very exciting, and I know that this is charges the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network with collecting the information. And as you say, you've described the situation in New York where there's a lot of empty buildings, and that's a phenomenon that's become international, but certainly in all the big financial centers. You, in general, have stood for financial transparency.
Yes.
And that goes to information coming out of the SEC, the CTFC, and there's another Financial Transparency Act. So maybe you could talk just a little bit about kind of the importance of that transparency.
Well, it's very important to combat money laundering and also terrorism financing. My bill doesn't provide full transparency on beneficial owners. The information isn't available publicly under my bill. I had to compromise with Republicans. They did not want it made public. It's only available to law enforcement and financial institutions. And that was a compromise I had to make in order to get bipartisan support. There were very strong concerns on the Republican side about making the information public, and I thought their concerns were legitimate, and we could achieve our goal without making the information public. So we agreed on that. The title of my bill is the Financial Transparency Act. Is also a very good transparency bill because it will standardize how companies report their financial information publicly, which will make it much easier to read and understand. But what the bill is really intended to benefit investors, that particular bill, not law enforcement. But I think transparency can help in a lot of different contexts. The Financial Transparency Act was just for financial institutions, but ours would also be open to not only banks, but to law enforcement.
So, much of the effort has been to give the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network a bigger role. There is some feeling, I think, that people here at the financial institutions would love it if this was pushed down to the state, but you've talked about, the need for compromise, that states at incorporation level.
If I could answer that.
Yeah.
The states didn't want it. And in fact, they didn't want the responsibility. There's a big concern in Congress for states' rights, but the fact that the states all signed off on it, and the AGs all signed off on it, and requested for a centralized database on the federal level.
This is absolutely true, and I think the banks are a little bit anxious that they'll still have too much to do, but at the same time, it's a great step forward that there's going to be this central database. How do we, you've been a big one for public-private partnerships and information sharing. Have you thought about, well, I'm sure you've thought about, but can you give us your thoughts about, data sharing, how do we keep that and protect privacy at the same time? Law enforcement, financial institutions, which will have access to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network data and everything, and how do we protect privacy too?
Well, first I want to talk a little bit about the banks. The banks, after 9/11, the country was in crisis, and we put a terrible burden on banks. We told them you had to know your customer. And so they had to really spend millions, hundreds of millions of dollars finding out who all of their customers are. And in tapes that law enforcement has from criminals and everything, they're talking about how banks are doing such a great job. You'll be caught if you go to a bank. So banks are doing a great job. A big breakthrough in this bill is when we allowed banks for their own compliance for Know Your Customer to have access to the FinCEN database. And that would allow them to cut down on the paperwork and burden and be able to access that information. So that was a huge part. We have great support from all financial industries, the real estate industry, everybody. Now, a big concern is also for privacy. We have strong privacy protections, but law enforcement has no access unless they have an active, investigation that they have to see this information for our own, our own protection. Okay.
So, you've been optimistic, you say, that there's some bipartisan support. I think that some of the catch is that there are Republicans who want to have more exemptions to the bill, but you want to give us the odds in terms of passage in an election year, of course.
This was such an important bill that when President Obama was in office, he created a task force just to try to pass this bill because it was considered a national security, good government concern. I remember going over there to these meetings in the Situation Room, and everybody was working on getting this bill through. We were not able to get it through. I've always continued to work. I finally got good, strong bipartisan support, and we passed it out of the House. But because of the work that had been going on for years, there were a number of senators that were interested. Mark Warner and Tom Cotton worked together. Now Sherrod Brown and Mike Crapo are working together on their own bill. So their White House from Rhode Island, he had a bill. So there's a lot of interest in the Senate on it. But Sherrod Brown and Sherrod and Mike are the co-chairs of the Banking Committee, and they have now picked up the bill. So that is a very, very serious bill. And if they don't get to an agreement and get it through, then Then you have the Warner Cotton bill. There are a lot of bills out on it. I believe it's going to pass this year because it's important to our national security, and there's been a lot of push for it and a lot of work done on it. And we have solid bipartisan support, and everybody knows that the AML system needs to be reformed, and they're working on a compromise bill, and once we see it, we'll have hearings on that. If they pass it, it'll go to a conference committee where our bill is. But the bill they're working off is very similar to the one that I've had in for years. But if we go to conference, we'll just iron out the differences between the two bills, and I'd be okay with the Senate just passing my bill as it is. But I think it will happen. It's needed, and there's so much support behind it from so many good government groups, such as yours. And I hope all of you will reach out to your senators and tell them that it's important to combat money laundering and to really help the system at large, and also to combat terrorism financing.
I think that this group, this is near and dear to their hearts, and I think that's one of the reasons that we're so pleased to have you here. I've got one last question for you. You talked about control and oversight of financial institutions, and you've been a big advocate for transparency. Maybe if you could say just a little bit about, you were one of the 5 in the House who asked Facebook to enact a moratorium on its Libra effort and its planned cryptocurrency Calibra, if I can say it right. What are your concerns, and what's going to happen with cryptocurrency?
Well, I was very concerned. You want to talk about money laundering. This would be a haven for money laundering. They were already selling women on cryptocurrencies in Europe. It's being used to launder money as it is. And I think that we should be very cautious and work out how we're going to oversee it and regulate it before you go out and create this entire system. So I felt that we had a hearing and they couldn't answer our questions. They couldn't answer our questions on how they were going to set it up, how they were going to monitor it, how they were going to make sure that it wouldn't be money laundering. And as I said, cryptocurrency is already being used for money laundering. If you can go to periodicals in Europe, they're literally selling women on it. You know, contact this number and we'll bring an underage woman to you. I mean, it's really a problem. And I think they need to hit the pause button for a while until the Libra policymakers and regulators can figure out how they're going to regulate it. I'm sitting here we are about to pass this corporate transparency bill that will help law enforcement, help the financial industry, help the consumers, help the public, and all of a sudden you have this cryptocurrency coming up with absolutely no regulation, no way to control or find out who's behind it. They've already been tremendous scandals where people have lost millions and they can't hold anyone accountable, and it's a huge problem. You see on the internet and other places where cryptocurrency is being publicly used for criminal activities. So I think I don't want to ever stop innovation and new ideas, and I'm all for that, but you also have to protect investors, and you have to protect the public, and you have to protect the lives of people that could be hurt through a process that allows criminal activity with no accountability.
Well, as I said, we are honored to have you here because of the work that you've done on BSA reform and financial transparency. Also, where we had your colleague, Representative Ann Wagner, here earlier this morning talk about human trafficking, and that's been an issue that's been near and dear to your heart. And I'd like to call up to the stage our President and Managing Director, Rohit Sharma, who'd like to protect you with an award. Yes.
Oh, how exciting. Thank you.
We are so grateful.
Okay. I wish I could stay longer, but I have a meeting.
Well, we're glad you're keeping
with
the country.
With the speaker.
Thank you very
great,
much.
Great, thank you. Mm-hmm. Oh, how beautiful.
Thank you, all that you do.
Oh, thank you so much. On to passage. Look forward to working with you on this bill and other transparency issues, good government issues that your organization is championing. Thank you for your work.
Yes, no, thank you.
Thank you. Wow.
Representative Carolyn Maloney, thank you very much.